Hello everybody, my name is Alex, and today's video I'm going to be going over the second part in developing the VR shooter template. Now before I go and jump into this video, in the last video I went over grabbing the gun, and if you all go back and check that out, the link for that will be in one of these two videos here. In this video we will be going over how to actually use the gun to fire a projectile. So we'll be developing the projectile itself, and then we will have it so we can actually have it spawn approximately where we want it on the gun itself. And with that, before we go and jump into the video, if you find this helpful and you want to support the channel or anything like that, be sure to subscribe. It helps out a ton. With that, we'll go and jump right into the video. Alright, so here we are. I've gone ahead and loaded up the project from the last video, the VR shooter template project. So as I've already stated, we already have our gun in the scene that we're able to easily grab, pick up, move around, all that kind of stuff. So in this one we wanted to make it so that way we can actually fire some sort of projectile itself. To start out with that, first thing we're going to want to do is actually create the projectile that we want. And we're going to keep it fairly simple using just a regular ball. So we're going to go and start blueprint class. We're going to want an actor, will certainly work, and we will just call it let's call it bullet projectile. And there we go. We'll go and open this up. And since we're trying to keep this fairly simple, we're going to stick with just a spherical static mesh. Let me go and move this over here real quick. So to start out, let's go and create a static mesh here, and we will call this just bullet, and we'll give it a sphere static mesh. Let's do material sphere. How's that look? Looks pretty good. Let's just give it a different material, make it look a little bit nicer, and we will also go and set that as the root. So that'll probably take a sec. I don't think the material is loading quite right. I think that's probably gonna take a sec. It'll fix it. Oh, there it goes. So there's our bullet. So next thing we're going to want to do is we're actually going to need to attach a projectile movement component. Now this is actually a standard component that is built into Unreal Engine. This is actually designed for, as it states, projectile movement. So we can actually go around and modify a whole bunch of different values over here on the right side. I'll just leave that as projectile movement. So we can, as you can see, we can modify the speed it goes, if there's any sort of rotation that goes along with the speed, you know, all sorts of different things like that. We have all these different options. Most of these I'm not going to worry about for the moment. What I'm mostly concerned about right now is the projectile speed, as this will determine how fast or how slow the projectile needs to go. And I also want to look as well, if I recall it's right about here, yeah, projectile gravity scale. I'm going to set that to 0 for right now. Reason being is projectile gravity scale will actually determine how much the gravity affects the movement of the projectile. So when it's set to 1, it is affected by gravity as you would expect it to be. But I don't want that to be affected by gravity, because since this is a bullet, we want it to travel in a, you know, straight-ish line. On top of this, we're also going to want to increase the speeds. I found that typically around 1,000 and up tends to work best for most projectiles, bullet projectiles. I find that tends to work pretty good. Rotation follows velocity, and I think all the rest is all good. We don't need to worry about anything else. Something else we do want to worry about, though, is we do want to make sure that we have some form of collision attached to our component that we can use later on. Reason being is later on, the whole point of developing this is we want to be able to have this collide with some sort of low dummy that we're going to end up developing later on. And we're going to want to make sure that when it collides with this dummy, we're first off able to detect that's there, but then we want to despawn and deal damage as well. So in order for this, we're going to want a sphere collision, and we will attach that there. Let me see, how big is this right now? I think it's about the size of the sphere. No, it's about half the size. Let's increase the size a little bit. We'll go about 1.5. I think that'll do. 1.6. 7. Oh, that's fine. It wasn't updating. Well, we'll stick with 1.6. It's about the appropriate size that we're looking for. Something else we're going to want to do is make sure we're set to overlap all. Dynamic is definitely one of the better options. And yeah, so that should all do. So if we go ahead and head back and we open up our gun this time. Now we actually want to be able to fire from some sort of point on the gun. And in order for this to work, first off we need to actually know what point we're going to fire from. And this kind of goes back, we have, you know, a number of different ways we can do this. We can do, we can just memorize the location. We could possibly have like sockets or bones at certain points. But that would also mean that we would have to have the static mesh or skeletal mesh modified within a certain way. Because we don't really have most of these options, one of the better options that I've personally found is to use a scene component and attaching it to about where you want it to spawn. So if we actually go right here, we have a scene component. And we'll go and move this right up to about where the barrel of the gun is. We actually want it a little bit off because like I said, later on we're going to want to detect collisions. And we have a couple of options for that when we go to do that. But something that I would like to avoid having troubles with later on anyways is having any sort of collision with the gun itself. So we want as few collisions as possible with that anyways. So yeah. So with that, we have that. In case you're unaware, scene component, it's literally just a component. It's typically meant for like a little placeholder for some sort of thing. It's never seen in the scene or anything like that. It's strictly more useful for background, for developing things like spawning things and things like that. But anyways, next thing we're going to want to go on to, actually, did I compile save this? I did. Okay, I had to make sure. Next thing we're going to want to go on to is we're actually going to want to create a function that will actually spawn our projectile like we want it to. The reason we're going to do this is the whole way that this is going to work is from the moment we press the trigger, what will happen in the background is we will call function. We have a couple of options for where we can call the function. I find it's typically best to start in the player. So we will start in the player. Then we will move on to the hand, and then the hand will call the function to the gun. And it would be possible to kind of skip over the hand and just find what's connected to the hand. But for simplicity's sake, it might just be better to do it this way. And I'll explain a little bit more as we're going through. But anyways, for right now, we're going to go and create the function that we need to actually spawn the projectile. So we'll call this bullet fire. That should do. So what we want to do here is we want to spawn actor from class, and we will go and connect that there. Actually, before we do this, we do need a variable, something I did almost forget. We'll call it can fire. And what this is going to do is we don't want it to be like held down and then just like start spamming them or anything like that. So for this, we're actually going to, just for safety, we will actually have a can fire boolean in our gun that will determine if the next bullet is ready to fire or not. And we can do this if we go ahead, get can fire, we want to branch off this, and we'll actually need this as a stepping stone right in here. Make sure that this is true. Okay, and we of course will have to also make sure that that gets set to false and all that later. Yeah, no. So here we are. So this is the spawn actor. So in order to start this, first thing we're going to want to do is our class. Our class will be what we assigned our projectile name to be. In this case, it's bolt projectile. Then we also want to spawn transform. And this is where the scene component that we created earlier comes in. So we'll want to grab this, and we'll want to do get, if I recall, it's world transform, because we're not setting it to a parent, so it's not going to have any sort of relative. So we want to give it the world transform. Actually, we don't want to give it the full world transform. There's one thing we do want to change. So if we go and split this, actually, we do want the location, and we do want the rotation correctly. Scale, however, we're likely going to have to come back and modify later on. Reason being is I'm almost certain that the mesh that we have for the bullet is going to be too big, so we're going to want to scale it down, and this is where we'll come to do that. Of course, there are other ways of going about this, but this will be one of the easier ways to go about doing this. In the collision handling override, you can leave it as default. You shouldn't have any problem if you leave it as default. However, I typically prefer to set it to always spawn, ignore collisions, just to be sure that it will spawn. Just because if later on you're developing, it can be a little bit problematic if, you know, it's only spawning half the time, because maybe it's colliding with the gun, or maybe it's colliding with some other environmental structure, or maybe you have some invisible thing going on around, you know, in the area, like a force field or something. I don't know. There are circumstances where things will not always spawn. So just be safe. I typically prefer to do always spawn, ignore collisions anyways. And then once we're done with that, we do want to set can fire to false briefly. So that is that. So next thing we're going to want to do, before we move on to the player in the hand, we do want to make sure that can fire will be set back to true later on. And we have a couple of different options. We can create a second function. We can have it go through the event graph. If we really want to, we could refer to the inputs. However, I typically prefer to have all inputs handled in the player for two reasons. One, you have a sort of central location for where you can go to find all of your inputs. Secondly is if you do any sort of multiplayer networking setup, then things tend to run better if you start them in the player, because of the way networking works. The player is one of the few things that tends to be, I guess I should say is guaranteed to be in a scene that has some sort of control over what can be passed up to server, down to other clients, things like that. But anyways, going back to the can fire, just to keep it simple, we're going to go and just create a second function. We'll just call it bullet fire release, second function here, and we'll just very simply set can fire back to true. And that is that. With that, compile and save our gun, and should all work just fine. Next thing we're going to want to do is pull up our player as well as the hands. So if we go ahead, let's first pull up motion controller pawn, and then we're also going to need our BP motion controller. Alright, so here we are. So before we do anything, let's actually see if there's actually an input set for the trigger, or anything else for that matter. Let's see, we got grab and we got teleport, we got HMD teleport. Okay, so yes, so we currently have nothing that would really, that's assigned to, at the very least, the trigger on the controllers I'm using. Now, something that I do want to keep in mind is the fact that the trigger is used on the Vive as well as on mixed reality. Yeah. So because of that, maybe later on we'll have to come back and modify the inputs on those devices. I personally use an Oculus touch controller, which means that I don't know the full structure of how the Vive and mixed reality, all these other controllers work. I'm more set for how it works in Oculus. However, so since I'm working with Oculus, I'm going to stick with that for the moment, and then later on I'll have to come back and look and see what some better mappings would be for these other controllers. So let's go ahead and do, we'll say left hand fire, and we're also going to want one called right hand fire. Alright, so first thing we're going to want to do is go down Oculus Touch, and we want to look for Oculus Touch left trigger, and then Oculus Touch right trigger. There we go. So in case you're unaware, when looking at the controllers, so currently the grab is set to this controller, to this button on both the controllers, and we're setting fire to this button. And then by default, given the way that the virtual reality template works, if I recall, teleport is set to this one. Let me double check that. Yes, it is set to the thumbstick. So when we press it down, or it's also set to the lower button as well. So either of these two being pressed down will work as teleport. I think, to be honest, the only ones that aren't triggered is B. And I believe the thumbstick movement is actually mapped to axis down here. Yes, it is. I don't know if that's actually in use. I don't believe it is. But yeah. Just make sure we're on the same page there. All right. So now that we have our inputs set for the current controllers that I'm using right now, next we're going to want to jump over back to our pawn, and we shouldn't have anything interrupting it. We do not. So I'm actually going to go and step right here next to it, and we want to do left hand fire, and we want to do right hand fire. And we will need both these. Now in order for this to work, something I did almost forget about is we do actually need to jump over to the BP motion controller, as we're going to need to call some functions from here to the player. So going back to what I was explaining earlier, what we're going to do is we're going to start over here in the player, calling the input action. From here, we're going to call a function within the motion controller itself, and from there, the function we create here will call these functions on the gun itself. A little bit confusing, and I know it may seem a little bit, extended. However, I found that this tends to be one of the better ways to do it, to be honest. So this is the way we will do it. Actually, let me double check something. This is not set to public. So actually, we can do this kind of different. We'll do it this way because I think this way will be a little bit easier. So I'm going to set the attached actor to public. Reason being is, since at the moment we only have one thing we can interact with, we can use this and we can grab that here in the player and then trigger it from there. So we will go over here, and we will want to, this one we'll need to get the left controller, this one we will need to get the right controller. And in case you're unaware, these store references to the right and left hand. Strictly the BP motion controller that those hands are. So we can then grab our attached actor, Let's start with the left controller actually. Let's move this a little further down. So we can do this. First thing we're going to want to do is make sure it is valid. Not that one. We could have used that one and run it through a branch, but I find that this tends to be a little bit better. Alright. And actually we're going to want two of these. The reason being is we're also going to want one for the release as well. Alright. So then we're going to want to cast to gun on either one. Let me actually see if I can keep this a little bit cleaner. Okay, cast to gun. Okay. Next thing we're going to want to... Ooh, that's not what I meant to do. Let's try and move these down a little bit. So next thing we're going to want to do is, once we're here, this is the point where we want to call the functions that we created earlier. The bullet fire and the bullet fire release. So here we're going to call bullet fire. And this is called, just to run it back, this is being called on the press. So we're going to first check to make sure that we do in fact have something attached, which is the whole point of checking if it is valid. And then if it is, then we cast it to gun and we call the functions that we need to call in the first place. Next thing we're going to want to do is call bullet fire release, and this will be for the released. So it'll be the other half of what we want it to do. So there, and actually let me double check something real quick, because yes, I do want this set to true. I almost forgot about that. If it was set to false, then it would mean that the first fire that you shot would not work. So yeah, and then going back over here, we're basically going to want all of this, except we're going to want it for the right controller. And actually, we can probably just copy paste this, drag it down, just attach all the nodes we need. So we can do that, that, ta-da, done. Alright, with that being done, we should now be able to grab our gun and fire it using either hand. So we're actually going to go ahead and jump over here. Let me go and save this just to be sure, and we will actually go ahead and play this real quick, and be right back in a sec. Alright, so here we are. We are back. Of course, there was a little bit of tweaking that needed to be done. Nothing serious to the code or anything like that, but I'll run you through real quick and show you what did have to be done. Starting with the bullet projectile itself, the projectile movement did need to have its speed increase a little bit. I ended up changing both values to 5,000. I found that tended to work a little bit better. And then going on to the gun, I need to make two quick changes here. So first thing was in the bullet fire, which as I had said would probably need to be modified later on anyways. I ended up going through and decreasing the scale down to 0.1. I found that tended to work a little bit better. Then I also need to do some rotation. I need to add some rotations to the scene. Reason being is that, so first thing that happened was when being fired, it actually shot straight down. So I ended up having to move the rotation so that way it shot forward, because at first it shot down, then it shot left, and then I had it shooting straight. So yeah, just a little bit of tweaking, but not too bad. I ended up just changing the X value to 270 and the Z value to 90, which I found tend to work just like how we needed. So with that, let me go and show you how the final product at this stage looks. So if we go and jump into here, let me go ahead and get set up here. Come on. Alright, so if I actually go and grab it, you can actually see, of course it's being held like normal, and if I fire it, you can see it goes out fairly decent speed, and they're still big enough that you can notice them. Of course, the speed can be increased, the size of the projectile itself can be decreased even more, anything like that. And of course, it'll work with the left hand as well. Yeah, so this is kind of fun to play around with. I am finding something I didn't run into last video. This is spawning upside down when I grab it. Yeah, you can see it works with the left hand, and I will say that I find it rather amusing seeing these stick to the wall. I will be going through and making sure the projectiles will despawn and do things that projectiles should actually be doing in a VR shooter. But for now, this will do. We have our gun firing, we can move it around, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, alright, with that, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in this project and you want to see a little bit more about it, I'm actually putting this out on a GitHub repository as well, and I will be leaving a link to that repository down in the description. But with that, that's the end of the video. So until next time, see ya.